Ministra, ¿se puede sentar también? Listo. Okay. Okay, good afternoon. I hope you had a nice day so far, because we're now starting the most important session of the Transforming Transportation, which is balancing green infrastructure, balancing climate and economic growth. So I wanted to, first of all, welcome my fellow panelists. I will start with Mr. Luis Felipe Arosu de Mello. He's the Deputy Director of the Railway Concessions from the Ministry of Transport in Brazil. By his side, we have Mr. Shah, Mr. Syed Shah, Additional Chief Secretary, Planning and Development Department of the Government of Kipper. Sorry. Oh my goodness. KP, perfect. Yes, thank you so much. From Pakistan, I have on Vice Minister Maria Constanza, Deputy Minister of Infrastructure of the Ministry of Transport in Colombia, and I have my colleague here, Ian Twin, the manager for IFC Latin America PPP Advisory Service. So welcome, everyone. I think, after spending some time in Asia, in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, I come back to Latin America, and this is all I can think: green infrastructure, especially because of obviously the elephant in the room, the Amazons, and the areas that we have here in LAC, and how can we make a difference also for these areas. We all know here, we share the thought that infrastructure is very important for poverty reduction and for productivity and accessibility. And we have 1 billion people, generally the poorest fringes of the population, that still live 2 kilometers from a transitable road that is transitable all year round. But at the same time, when we have these conversations internally, the other day I was discussing with my colleagues from environment, they say, when we think of roads, we think of deforestation, we think of corruption. And I was like, okay, when I think of roads, I think of access, I think of jobs. And roads and infrastructure are all about these things. No, we have to recognize that and acknowledge that we also, create some problems on the way, right? So for instance, 90% of the deforestation in the Amazon occurs 5.5 kilometers radius of an existing road. And we need to think of alternative paths, alternative infrastructure. And obviously, we can't leave these populations completely separated from economic opportunities. So we really need to give a second look and not only simply say infrastructure is bad for the environment. We need to find the infrastructure that works for our countries and for our Amazon area, and in a manner that we are delivering both on development and also on the green objectives. We have just started, just wanted to highlight this work that we had started in the Amazon in partnership with IDB, our colleagues, to really look into the infrastructure gaps in the Amazon region. I think that the government needs to be there, right? Government needs to be there, policy needs to be there, and we have to occupy those spaces without using too much of a common term, but to offer alternatives to illegal trading, to all the problems that we have in these spaces. And we have here people that have experience on inclusion, on accommodating these multiple objectives, and that have been working hard on delivering on those objectives. So I'll start, the discussion, kick off the discussion asking Mr. Syed, how do you see the role of rural roads in overall development in provinces in Pakistan? What benefits have the country seen in terms of connectivity, safe mobility, access to health, education, and economic benefits?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. It's always a pleasure coming here, speaking to all of you august people here. As you asked, Pakistan, you have been there also, as I have heard you. We have a population of 240 million, and almost 147 million are still living in the rural areas. So it's a huge number, almost 62% of them. So when you talk of the rural areas, as you rightly pointed out, connectivity to the basic infrastructure and the facilities is the most important for us. We would like that our people who are living in the rural areas, they should have an access to the schools, to health facilities, to other economic entities from where they can earn their livelihood. With the poverty line that we have, specifically from the province where I come from, we have basically 4 big provinces in Pakistan. So KP is at number 3 if you talk of the development or everything. So here, the people usually living in the rural areas, they don't have the access to basic infrastructure. And as you mentioned, 2 kilometers, maybe it's true for Brazil or some other areas. But with us, with a population of almost 45 million, which lives in our province, these figures are not very good. And specifically, when we talk of these connectivity issues and we talk of the rural population, which goes to they want to need an access to the markets or the health or education facilities. This is something which we are lacking in my province at least. Furthermore, in our province in 2019, there was a big chunk of land which used to be a buffer area between our province and Afghanistan on the other side. It got merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KP for that matter. So that again had a population of almost 5.7 million people, an area as big as New Zealand. When they got merged with the KP, we had no other alternative to directly go and try to bring them at par with the rest of the districts which we had. And for that, we needed quite a handsome amount of money to bring them at par with the rest of the area. So we have started working on it. And from our own sources, from the federal government, there are development partners working with us. We are trying to bring them closer to what the other settled districts are at this moment. And rural infrastructure, the roads are the most important for us. We are working in other social sectors also, but talking of connectivity and making those people give access to other facilities, that is our top priority in the government right now. Yesterday also, I mentioned this because in that particular area, due to some cultural aspects, the girl education is suffering. The girls after primary education rarely go to the middle level. But the reason, as I mentioned yesterday, also are 3 basic reasons. One, that the schools, they don't have those boundary walls. So people are kind of shy away sending their daughters there. And then the hygiene facilities, the toilets are lacking there. And the number 1 thing is the access to those schools. As no roads are there, people don't send their children, and the dropout ratio, if I tell you, it's alarming. After this primary level, almost 79% of girls, they stop and they don't go to schools anymore. So this is our top priority right now. So we are trying to make those things accessible, make those people come to the schools. We are working at different levels to make sure that all the missing facilities that they face are addressed to. World Bank is assisting us in a project on that, also on the road sector, specifically aiming this that we should make sure that the education that we need to impart to those, especially the women folk, we kind of address to it as a top priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we see that it's not about roads, right? It's about access to schools. It's about inclusion of women, and girls, and it's about development in the end. No, so maybe let's start. We talked about inclusion, so let's now talk a lot about some experiences that we have in kind of balancing infrastructure growth and environmental conservation. I would like to ask Mr. Luis Felipe Arrusu, how have you encountered and faced this problem of balancing these 2 objectives? And maybe tell us a little bit about the experience that you've been having with FICOFIOL and in Brazil, which is, you please explain what it is and get us some inputs here. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, it is worth highlighting that Brazil is committed to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, also considering the guidelines of the national environmental policy provided by the Ministry of Environmental in Brazil. In this sense, to meet the guidelines, the Ministry of Transport is investing in this project, the Ficofiol project, which starts in the state of Bahia and reaches until the state of Mato Grosso. I would like to present some specifics about it. 1 minute.
Yeah, of course.
Well, in harmony with the principle of environmental sustainability, the Brazilian government has also expressed an interest not only in ensuring national food security, but also in contributing for the global food supply. This corridor will be able to provide access to exportation of grains in the country and most corn and soybeans. So this agribusiness that is concentrated in central region, central west region, and for food will reach people at affordable prices, and it's necessary investment to reduce logistics costs and replace truck transport with rail transport. To this end, projects are being studied to enable the flow of the national harvest, hence the importance of this project of Ficofiol.
Thank you very much. And this is, a large scale project that is being implemented in Brazil. And obviously, there are concerns in this day and age, rightly so, there are concerns on how you can actually deliver these projects. Now you have another one that is quite controversial, which is the Ferrogrão, which goes through the Amazon areas, etc. How have you been working to balance those elements and to get the sort of the support of the environmental ministries and the assurance that this is not going to cause more deforestation?
Well, the environmental studies carried out by the World Bank regarding the Ficofiol corridor are being considered as an important way of information to serve as a benchmark for future studies. So it contributed favorably to harmonize the conservation needs and the surrounding environment with the corridor. So we are very concerned about the question of the national parks and the other protected areas in this process of environmental licensing of these projects. So what we could say right now is that in the case of the Ficofiol corridor, it's already partially or completely licensed in the environmental matter with the agency called IBAMA, which does this license process in the construction that is in progress in the states of Bahia and Goiás. In the case of Ferrogrão, the issue is being monitored by the Supreme Court, and the Ministry of Transport forwarded recently environmental impact studies yesterday on the railway to support the decision of the Supreme Court on the continuity of the studies of this project.
Thank you very much. So let me now pass on to Ministra Maria Constança. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about the key outcomes of the recent PATIs, the Amazon Plan for Sustainable Intermodal Transport that Colombia has developed, and how Colombia is planning to develop infrastructure while maintaining environmental conservation in the Amazon.
Gracias, Bianca.
Thank you, Bianca. In the case of Colombia, where we are also working in the Amazonian region that represents 41% of our land. We are a small percentage of the Amazon region, but it represents 2/5 of our land, and it's an essential biomass at a global scale. One of the objectives of our country is also to control deforestation and to have that understanding that development needs infrastructure. But the question is, how can we create that combined transportation solutions that would recognize the value at different levels, economic, social, and cultural, of regions. And this is the work we've carried out in a region that concentrates 2% of our population. Our first step was to understand their needs, understand that indiscriminate opening of these roads can lead to deforestation, and our objective is to limit these negative impacts. We designed a plan in 30-year periods with short, medium, and long-term actions and interventions with that vision towards infrastructure, with an investment that could reach $1 billion in the coming 30 years. But what is the most remarkable aspect of this plan? We collaborated with local communities, and the first element that we noticed was that communities don't feel there's a need to open up through other corridors. They only want to leverage the existing roads, and 50% of this territory are also reservations for indigenous populations, and they are protected by our local legislation. And that creates even additional issues when it comes to designing a plan. So this plan, 30-year plan, has the focus of bringing infrastructure, but leveraging also natural resources such as rivers, to have access to new technologies, using rivers to foster connectivity, because our land, our country has a specific aspect. Most of investment has been focused in our Andean region, our central region. And then there's a high percentage of our population that has been left in the margins of these investments. And what we've seen in this transportation plan, great potential. Colombia has a series of infrastructures and plans related to them. We have a railway, we have a general infrastructure plan in terms of productivity and connectivity. Now, this regional plan adds an additional layer when it comes to integrating these communities, understanding the internal dynamics, controlling deforestation, and also preserving natural assets. Colombia has 124,000 kilometers of rivers. And one of the things we've noticed working with these communities is that message. We don't need more roads. We don't need an external invasion. We don't need new deforestation. What we need is to leverage those existing means of transportation.
And I want to tell a little bit of an anecdote. The other day we were having a session on discussing the stakeholders of the Amazon region, right? The World Bank, the IDB. We want to have sort of an integrated vision for the Amazon that goes across boundaries, that looks that as a continuous region that has a lot of communication between countries, etc. And so we had a session, and the first 15 minutes we were supposed to discuss the stakeholders, right? And so we had lots of environmental experts, infrastructure experts, etc. And after 2 hours, we couldn't decide on the list of the stakeholders, So that's the amount. I mean, the Amazon is such a rich, really environment and complex environment, and adds the layers of all the institutions that work there and the lack of coordination, etc. So it really is a complex environment to work in, that we're learning and trying to move forward on this. But I wanted to come back to Pakistan. I wanted to ask Mr. Seth, we have, and I was in that time, I was in the South Asia region. So I remember vividly, the WhatsApps and the information about the floods in September 22 now. How have you managed to overcome that challenge in the context of climate change and resilience? And what are you doing? I mean, tell us, how was that experience and what changed?
Thank you so much. As you all know, Pakistan contributes less than 1% to the global warming, but we are the eighth most vulnerable on the planet right now. And the climate-induced events that we have been experienced in the past, they are becoming more and more frequent now. If you recall, there was a flood in 2010, and it devastated the whole country. I would just quote to you a couple of figures. You would now realize that how this intensity is going up. In 2010 floods, the damage was mostly in one of our very beautiful scenic valleys of Swat. And that river Swat which flows normally at 14 to 16,000 cusics in summers, it swelled up to 175,000 cusics during that flood. And lots of lives were lost and the properties were damaged. In 2022, can you imagine that the same river, it swelled up to 246,000 cusics. Now, this was something we never expected. And all our workings, which we were doing, and we were trying to make designs that could last the floods, this baffles everybody, because how are you going to plan if the frequency is such and the amount of the water which comes in is of such a huge amount? Then again in 2022, and when we were working through what we need to actually do to cope with this, because we knew that it is there now, and now all was left to go for adaptation, because mitigation days are over now for us. So we have developed a cell in our planning and development department, because I look after the budget and all the planning and development schemes that we have for a year that comes to my office. So we developed a cell, we were the first one in the province to do that, in the country to do that. And because of the reason that we are located in the northwest of Pakistan, so any eventuality which happens climatically, we are the first one to bear it, and then the water ultimately flows down to Punjab and Sindh for that matter. So this cell now we are trying to induce into all the schemes that climate resilience aspect, whether it's the road, or it's a bridge, or even if we're designing the culverts also, we make sure that we take that environmental aspect in our planning. And all the departments, which are these construction departments, they come up with the projects which has climate resilience built into them. Now, but there's a flip side to it, because then it raises the cost of those projects. So that is one thing which we are trying to grapple with, because the federal government, the funds which transfers to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are not that much which can cater for these projects. So naturally, then we have to go towards the development partners. We have an excellent contribution from them. They're almost 1/3 of the funding which is coming into the promise are through different development partners in shape of grants, in shape of loans, soft loans that we have. And we are now trying to develop our own roads asset management system, so that we should know that which road needs repairs. Because when a major catastrophe happens, the immediate response is to go for the relief and try to get the people out of there and try to reconnect all the links which have been broken. When the time of rehabs come, then we have to look for avenues for the financing of those projects. So now we are trying to have a road asset management system so that we should know in advance, and we should try to do as much possible to maintain those roads which are very critical, which are the main arteries, so that in time of need, because spending $1 today will save us almost $6-7 in the days to come. So we are trying to work on that. And specifically with the region from where I belong, or our promises, it has a diverse topography. There are mountains in the north, and there are plains there, and some part of desert also there. So we have to make sure that whatever design structure that we have, it can cater for. If it is in the north, the bridge, the space, or the embankments are to be enforced or something. And we come to the planar areas, we make sure that the culverts, we need to make more so that the water can pass through. It should not get trapped and have a ponding effect, which it had in the last floods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, going through a tragedy like this, it makes you rethink and replan and re-strategize, no? And unfortunately, we're having to spend much more. That's the truth. And in countries that are so infrastructure deprived already, making this extra investment, but it's either that or not having the infrastructure, right? And so I think that the challenge is that, how much do we invest on redundancies, on extra costs that, that will last longer. And these decisions are never easy to make under this situation and under uncertainty. But I wanted to go back to the experience of Brazil a little bit, Luis. We supported, the government of Brazil together with IFC on the study of the potential induced deforestation, that the FICO-FIOL would cause, and again we keep the potential induced deforestation, etc., because it's potential. We don't know if this is going to happen or not. So I wanted to understand a little bit the government intentions to adopt that methodology, and maybe you can go over the methodology a little bit for other projects as well, and what has been the experience of the ministry.
Okay. I'd like to highlight the importance of this study, but in the same sense, the rail projects structured by the Ministry of Transport in Brazil, they are generally being implemented considering Brazil legal framework, which requires a series of studies, including studies related with component of indigenous communities affected. So in these preparations, in these studies of environmental impacts, there are analysis of these indigenous components, and during this process, consultations are carried out with indigenous communities in the vicinity of the railways, bearing in mind that this needs to be done in advance with quality of information and with freedom of expression about the community's perception of the impact of the rail project. So regarding the FICO-FIOL corridor, we see positively this sort of study, and we intend to use it for future projects.
Thank you very much, Luis. So now let's talk about money, no? Let's talk about policy first. So maybe Ian, my colleague here from the IFC, maybe you can discuss a little bit, how the policy, the legal and the regulatory frameworks would allow us to increase. What are sort of how can we enable those elements, to allow us for increasing private financing of green infrastructure, especially in these long neglected territories? How are we going to do this with the private sector?
Thanks very much, Bianca, and thanks for reducing me to the money bags. So thanks for inviting me to come speak today. And I think it's been a really nice, session so far. So hopefully I don't ruin it. I think the first thing I would note is that some of the key drivers of whether an institutional framework will work for attracting the private sector are they really the same, whether it's a rural project or not, or whether it's a green project or not, right? The conditions are the same. Maybe they just are more impactful or not. And so the first thing would be, is it a stable, credible legal framework? So do you have a solid PPP law or regulation? And do you have a credible counterpart, be that the grantor or be that the regulator or both, depending on the sector? Now that framework will vary by sector. So things that happen in water or sanitation or in electricity are going to be different from transport. Obviously, we're at a transport conference. I'm going to focus on transport from now on. In terms of what that framework, how it works, I think the World Bank Group, you guys taking the lead on it, can really help governments think about, how does it work today and make recommendations on what would be best practice. I think that's valuable. I'll say a bit more about that later on. But then once you've got that framework established, the next thing is, figuring out how is that infrastructure going to be paid for? Is it going to be user pay? So is it like tariffs and, a toll road or something like that? And if so, is that tariff affordable? Is the user demand realistic? And, is it politically sustainable? If it's not going to be user pay, it's going to be some form of government payment. And then it really goes to the counterparty's creditworthiness. So do you have a credible counterparty? And if not, what can you do to make that better? I think the next thing that goes to the attractiveness of a project would be the size of it. So obviously different size of projects are attractive to different kinds of counterpart. So a smaller investor might be very interested in even smaller projects. If you want a big international player, depending on how you set it up, it might be less attractive for them. So you need to think about what is your market in terms of the guy that you're going to be working with. Now, even if you have a small project, there's still ways that you can do to kind of maximize interest and therefore maximize the competitive tension in terms of getting the best value for money. So one way to do that is to group smaller projects together, call them a program, and that will tend to attract people. Because obviously when you think about bidding for a project, there's a lot of, sunk costs in doing that, looking at the legal framework, looking at the concession, whatever the legal framework is, doing the due diligence. And if you think that, okay, even if I don't win this one, when I've read the concession, it's going to be the same for that one, and that one, it's more worth your while to do that. And likewise, when you bid for something, even if that's small, if you think it's going to lead to opportunity to bid for other projects in the same region, you can kind of scale up that way. And we've seen that kind of play out, for instance, in street lighting in Brazil, where we have a program with Caixa, where we did 11 projects now, and they're working on another 100. We've also seen it play out to some extent in roads in Brazil, and also even in the airports, right, where some of the airport operators have bid for smaller projects, knowing that they're going to fit in with other ones they've already got. So I think that's important. Then a final factor that might be relevant depending on the country is just the FX, and depending on the sponsor is FX risk and what you're doing to mitigate that. That might not be relevant in a larger country like Brazil. It could be very relevant in a smaller country, and it would really go to who is your sponsor and are they national or international. Now, another consideration, in the title, we've got green infrastructure, and we've been talking about, basically, the risks around that for an investor. And so really it's like, does it go through sensitive sites? Does it go through environmentally sensitive areas? Does it affect indigenous folks? What kind of mitigants can you build into that? When we're advising projects, we typically recommend you use the IFC performance standards, and that kind of gives you a framework for managing that. And then as you've started, and we've heard from the panelists, where if you think about it's going somewhere very sensitive like the Amazon, how do you think about deforestation? How do you manage those risks? So that's something that investors will want to think about and sort of see how you're, as a government, approaching that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, very much. And is there any, if it is to finance green infrastructure, there's more appetite for risk, or no? It's you say the frameworks are the same. There's more appetite, you think? Are we in a different situation than we were 10 years ago, let's say?
I think there's a lot more focus on green, on the environment now, obviously, and also on climate change now. So I think it will be hard to get financing increasingly difficult to get financing for projects that don't take into account, for instance, climate risk. And then obviously there's a lot of focus on ESG issues in the last 5-10 years increasing. Now there's some political pushback in some quarters about that, but I think that's another thing that it may become harder and harder to get money.
Thank you. It's the availability of money that is not going to be there, right? So Ministra, coming back, we had the opportunity to have lunch today, and we were discussing this program, coming from projects to a program, and how can, we support. So I wanted to hear a little bit more from you on the vision for development of infrastructure on these rural regions in Colombia, and the challenges that you guys face to attract private investment, because that's Ian was talking a little bit about what they require, right? What the private sector requires, but maybe you can explore what your own experience with this.
Thank you, Bianca. In fact, we were just discussing the challenges and the needs that a country such as Colombia has. Today, we still need to satisfy needs in the development of cities, urban public transportation, improving connectivity and efficiency in the country to improve trade, to connect our ports, to create resilience and also redundancy in our infrastructure, which underpins the strategic development of the country. And the need for investment in faraway areas areas that are similar to what I was mentioning when I was talking about the Amazonic Transportation Plan. We face a big challenge today, financing. When we look at this sector and compare it to others in our country, maybe there are 19 sectors for development and transportation is one, but there are needs vis-a-vis education, health, social matters. So when we go to the central government to ask for investments in infrastructure, some believe that maybe we are at the third rung where it comes to priorities because there are other priorities. Against this backdrop, for us, it is a challenge. We have to see how can we reinvent financing. We were talking with you about our sector. Today, we are the ones that have the greatest amount of resources allocated for investments. We have been given the greatest amounts, but the reality is that those have already been earmarked. About 70% of those resources are earmarked for certain things. We need to look at new sources of financing. We have to see how to reprogram some fiscal space and so as to create some line items in the budget so that the country can, for example, focus on climate change. Each time we're hit by La Nina, we lose resources. In 2010 to 2011, we saw what happened. And then in 2022, we suffered La Nina again. We should have been ready for it, but it was not the case. The challenge today is how to reach those faraway areas, how to get funding. Quite likely the government will need to take care of those investments because these are sectors where probably that appetite by the investors or that possibility of accepting risk, well, this will be more on the side of the public sector. Today, we were having a discussion with the multilateral banks and countries such as Colombia. We need to have clear investments. The World Bank is with us on an initiative to invest in the Colombian Pacific. This is an area of the country that requires so many more investments. I dare say 60% of the territory in Colombia calls for new projects, new investments, greater connectivity, and to see how we can innovate in these investments. How can we bring those investments to the present sources, such as valuation, that can allow us to move forward with this development?
The minister shared this project that we're supporting. We have a video at the end that I want to show you because it is really nice. But back to Ian, maybe Ian, highlighting a little bit the efforts towards strengthening and supporting the private sector and the government for that matter, on how to bring the private sector in. What are you guys doing and what are the results so far?
Thanks, Bianca. So just as a quick recap, so the IFC, we're the private finance arm of the World Bank Group. So when you think of the World Bank Group, you're actually typically thinking about IBRD. So we're in the building of the IBRD. There are 5 different bits to the World Bank Group. We're and we're all kind of sisters. We all exist under our own separate treaties. We all have our own separate member countries, groups of member countries. So we're kind of together, but not really. We live down the street. But what we were set up to do is basically encourage the private sector to invest in developing countries. We do that mostly by making loans or equity investments together with the private sector, right? So that's the bulk of what we do. And as part of that, one bit does lending to subnational governments. So we can't lend if the federal government gives a guarantee, but if it doesn't, we can kind of lend to a city or a municipality or a region, right? And so part of what we do that's, germane to our conversation today is that subnational lending, right? So as an example, 10, 12 years ago, I worked in Turkey. I was responsible for the infra portfolio in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And back in that time, some of the projects we had were, it financed rural roads in Russia. And, you could see all the benefits that you were talking about earlier about access to jobs, access to, health, education, even shopping, right? So you could really see that. So that's part of what we do. Now, where I fit is slightly different because my bit, which is smaller, advises governments on how to structure PPPs, right? And really, that's how do you pull in the private sector to implement a project? How do you get efficiency by pulling the private sector in? What we do kind of varies depending on the sophistication, the experience of the client government. So if you're new to doing PPPs, we can work together with the World Bank, like I said earlier, look at the framework, the law that you have, figure out if it's, needs any changes, kind of advise you on best practices, etc. So that's one thing. Then once you've got that framework sort of together and you have an implementing agency, we can then help you prioritize different projects. So you might have a list of, 20 projects that you're considering doing. We can help you think through which ones of those are, from a cost benefit point of view, make the most sense, which ones could be prioritized, and then which ones of those are conducive to being done as PPPs. And then once you have that sort of ones that you've picked out and you say, this is the ones I want to do as a PPP, we can help you kind of stitch that PPP together. So we can work with consultants to do the due diligence package, so the legal review, the environmental social review, the market study, the technical study, basically everything that you would need to do to be able to sort of put together a viable project. And we would then recommend, this is how you could consider structuring that project, how long it should be, what the conditions of it should be, how you should get paid, how it should be paid, and then help you run the bid process. Now, we won't tell you who to pick, that's on you, but we can kind of help you run all the way through to the end of that point, right? And that's a way for us to kind of grow the market of infrastructure investments. And we'll do that right across the sort of infrastructure space. Obviously, transport's 40-50% of what we do, but we're also doing things like rural broadband, water and sanitation in rural areas, electricity in rural areas as well. The FICO Fiol is a project we've been working on with Brazil. As we do those projects, we're taking into account the climate elements, be that mitigation and adaptation. And, the World Bank Group and IFC have made commitments to being Paris aligned. So as we do those projects, we're basically working on projects to make sure that they will, in the end, be Paris aligned. I think I'm going to stop there because she's waving money.
We have one less.
Okay. And then the other thing that we try to take into account is, as climate change is real, how do you bake into the design of the project, the greater, you're making it more resilient. So exactly what the minister's been talking about in terms of, what they're facing in Pakistan with greater floods. How do you project out for that? And then how do you work with this private sponsor to make sure that they incorporate those considerations into the design of the project? And that goes back to being Paris aligned. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, por favor, Ministra.
Please go ahead, Minister. I wanted to share a thought. In the case of Colombia, all of those business sectors where we have structuring, where we have the private sector in our country, this has already been done. We have a PPP model for the aviation sector. We have one for ports. Also through concessions, we have private investment. This model has been very successful. It's very robust. We also have a PPP model, and we are a role model where it comes to roads with public and private initiatives. So we have a series of initiatives and investments. We could identify between 5 and 10 projects we are missing to complete this first phase vis-a-vis our strategic infrastructure. But part of the needs we face today is these other areas in the territory, areas where there will be no services that will give rise to profits. This is why the central government will need to be interested in doing this, and we will need multilateral development banks so as to connect those regions of the country. I believe that is the greatest challenge we face. So many of the other sectors already have private investment. They have it there through the way in which these models have been structured. And they continue to add onto that infrastructure with more kilometers, more development. But our governments have to think about those faraway regions. If we apply the normal cost-benefit ratio model, we will not get there. Here we need to think about the social benefit. This is what we are taking into consideration, to be very assertive and have important investments so that these areas with a smaller population, with lower productivity, for them to have equity. In the country, we talk about regional convergence. How can we work so that development can get everywhere and to have more equity in our countries? I believe this is the big challenge for leaders of public policy, to have resources allocated to those territories that so desperately need public investment with the support of public policy.
That's the challenge that we're trying to face. No, I think if there is enough public money, great, but probably there isn't, and to resolve this. So our challenge is how to group these projects, how to, we've been talking about, you're reaching a difficult area. You can't do, a transport project separate from a digital project, separate from an energy project. Getting there is so hard. Let's just do the entire infrastructure. Let's involve the communities. Let's make sure, we have the digital project where we are training the communities to do the sort of the maintenance of the Wi-Fi, etc. These are regions that are not going to generate the same bang for the buck in finance terms, but it will generate lots of positive economic outcomes and obviously development. So that's the challenge that we are trying to face: how to aggregate this, how to make the governance works in a manner that the private sector feels that, okay, there's a package there, I'm interested, I want to go and I want to try. So we keep looking for these opportunities. Ben, are we at the end of the session, or do we have time for a few questions? Okay, perfect. Yes, please. Do we have a microphone, Ben, to the maybe? Oh, just speak up. Thank you.
Alice, work with big data and trying to use information to predict patterns, mobility patterns. And when we talk about climate, when we talk about resilience, when we talk about safety, we talk a lot about risk and the right risk, the less costly risk that we should take. But we also talk in a more quality way about not doing something, the price of not doing something, but we don't have methodology to get this number, to understand this. And in the end of the day, a lot of our tools, they end in the balance, and we don't know, we don't have this capability to understand what's going to cost us not do something. So I would like to know from you, especially from FEC, if you have engaged in projects like that and trying to understand this other side of the coin that is not making a decision, how we get to the number, how we get to this information, so we can better try to understand and try to give this information for population as well when we make a decision, when we choose to do a project or not.
I'm going to pass that to Ian because it's a very difficult question, but I think the price of not doing something, we're very good on this. No, we know we have lots of examples. So
thanks very much, Bianca. It's a really good question, right? I mean, we do the conventional cost benefit analysis, right? And then there's a public policy choice, which is, is it still worth me doing this project because of the benefits it will have for this region, irrespective of the quick payoff relative, just because of the population density or whatever? We do not have a good way, I would say, at IFC of thinking about, like, if I don't do this, what's the impact of that, right? Sometimes we really get caught up, particularly on the environmental social side, with, do no harm, and how do you think about the range from do no harm and do nothing to the, trade-off to the, okay, well, if I do this railway project for the sake of argument and it results in induced deforestation, what is the net benefit of that? And if I do this one, does that mean that the country won't do that one, which will be way more harmful, right? And then you get completely lost, because then you're talking about options analysis and whatever. So honestly, it's a really good question. We don't have a good answer. And we just we just become the practitioners that put our head down and get on with doing a project. Right?
No, maybe I can complement this. The price of not doing something, and we see in the Amazon, right? The Amazon is dominated by illegal trade, by illegal activities, and we see that people continue in poverty. So that's the price of doing nothing. In our economic analysis, to come back to the example that Ian said, I think we were discussing also with the minister this lunch was a very good lunch, but also we were discussing the sustainability, for instance, of the public transport systems. And we haven't achieved what we wanted. The modal share is still not there. We needed to, we made so much investment. We're not seeing the results. Well, if you hadn't done, it would have been much worse. And I think that's the methodology is at least in that spectrum. But I think in what we are still struggling is the cost of doing nothing in these remote regions. That's what we are really trying to, I think that there's a conscious decision at this point of not doing something, so that's, I think it's a great start.
I just, it's giving the example earlier on about these rural roads in Russia that we did as a subnational loan. And it was, I remember we have the IEG, I don't know what it's, Independent Evaluation Group, and they look at all the projects that we do. And they were doing a review of one of these, projects that we'd done. And we were really struggling with them to quantify the value of having better access to jobs and health and education and shopping. I mean, how do you put a value on it? It was really complicated. We just kind of got lost and gave up at some point. Yeah, sorry.
I wanted to share something else. Some data that can help you get to that answer with concrete cases. In the case of Colombia, I was telling the audience this morning in my panel that La Niña in Colombia, recovering the infrastructure we lost only in roads between the end of 2021, during 2022 and beginnings of 2023, that will cost about 30% of the resources we have allocated so far. This is the cost of the infrastructure we have lost. Another case in Colombia, we have this railway between Villavicencio and Bogota. Having this closed one day, this is highly vulnerable as a result of climate change, the intensity of the rains. One day of that road being blocked, that would be enough for the investments that we require for that area. So data shows that the cost could be between 10 and 30% of what you would be spending if you don't make a decision. We need to give priority to maintenance and the management of infrastructure. We make huge investments in infrastructure, adding kilometer after kilometer, but how much are we allocating to the maintenance of this infrastructure? Out of every 10 pesos, we should give 3 or 4 to maintenance of infrastructure. We need to manage our assets. We need to work in a preventative fashion on our infrastructure. We see the risk of climate change in our countries. We have high vulnerability. At the same time, sometimes there are bad practices in the preservation of infrastructure.
More questions from the public? Oh, so I guess I would like to thank the panelists very much for being here, for exchanging. information, and I'm sure we're going to keep parallel conversations after this. And if you guys can turn on the video, we can relax and see and talk at the same time. Thank you very much.
Video.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. We made her work a lot in the last 4 days. Yes, she was supposed to be on one panel and then she was on 4. So, but I didn't have time. Yeah, no, I'm my colleagues all the time they went, and I was sort of participating from here. In the fourth section also we've been bothered. ¿Dónde van?
Hay que estar de pie y boga, para Río Manso conseguir. El Fondo Todos Somos Pacífico es la iniciativa del gobierno nacional para mejorar la calidad de vida de los habitantes del litoral. Esta noticia llegó a través de la emisora y Rosita prende el radio siempre a la misma hora para estar bien informada de estas obras que enamoran. Es como una canoa que con corriente quiere subir. Hay que estar de pie y bogar para Río Manso conseguir. Para reducir los accidentes y se pueda mejor navegar, se construirán unos muelles para toda la comunidad. En La Tola, en Olaya Herrera, en Santa Bárbara de Escuandé, en El Charco, en Timbiquí, en Mosquera y en López de Micay también. Esto es como una canoa que con corriente quiere subir. Hay que estar de pie y bogar para Río Manso conseguir. En la vía navegable, desde Salahonda hasta Timbiquí, se pondrá señalización para quienes transitemos por aquí. Que estos viajes sean más seguros y en mejores condiciones para mujeres embarazadas, para niños y adultos mayores. También se harán proyectos de agua limpia, que llamamos agua potable. Se pondrán acueductos en Tumaco, Salahonda, Guapi y Timbiquí, comadre. Esto es como una canoa que con corriente quiere subir. Hay que estar de pie y jugar para Río Manso conseguir. Que cuándo van a empezar las obras, el pueblo está preguntando. Estas serán paso a paso y esto es lo que ya está empezando. Para el municipio de La Tola, la contratación del muelle ya empezó. Y en Timbiquí, el acueducto ya se contrató. Luego vendrán los otros municipios. De eso estoy segura yo.
Para Río Macho conseguí